Great.
Thanks for joining us today. So we are talking to Rahib Amin, and I'm sure I just butchered his name again, which is always fun and exciting. But he is a API strategist and somebody that is, spent a lot of time thinking about all of the things that go together of building your business outcomes, putting these things together, and how do you actually serve that stuff up to people. So thanks for joining us, and nice to get a chance to chat.
Yeah, pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me for sure, Chris.
So I guess, like, tell me a little bit about yourself. Like, how did you get to where you are today? A lot of people might say, how did you end up being an API strategist? Like, where did you come from, and what led you to chatting to me today?
Yeah, thanks for asking that, Chris. It's definitely an interesting question, especially when you get to hear what I have to tell you here. So I kind of, first of all, I wanted to thank you for the nice introduction there. But I wanted to say that I kind of landed into API strategy from a completely backwards, some place where you might not have expected at all. But I'll give you a little background about how I got here, right? So I was actually born and raised in Saudi Arabia with parents from Pakistan. And I came to the States early in the 2000s to take on an educational career, starting from boarding school to college and other things. Um, Very early on, I had my interest and my passion kind of clearly laid out for myself. I was gonna be a professional guitarist and a professional musician, and that's all there was to it. College and schooling was just kind of the thing that needed to get taken care of so I could eventually do that, which is interesting where I am now. Uh, but essentially, my educational career was learning lots of different things, lots of different ways of using technology, lots of musical education. That really did start to become part of my passion. But as I got into college, I started to think about things that were perhaps more valuable to study, right? That wasn't your music degree, with some added pressure from my folks and family, as expected for a Southeast Asianer. So with that said, I went along and I started to explore career options such as information systems, kind of product, I should say, management. And at that point, I didn't really have a clear understanding of product management. But I started looking at things like information systems, and I was loosely touching on things like, product strategy, and what databases and things like that meant to folks. Eventually, I fell out of the education game, and I started to realize that a lot of the theory that may have appealed to me, I just didn't have a real way to touch it and play with it, and it didn't appeal to me, I guess was the best way to put it. So that kind of began my kind of professional journey. It started actually interesting with the radio station job at my college at Eckerd College,
Yeah.
where we had a non-functioning radio station, but you'd be surprised they had all the equipment there, so all these technical boards and all these wires everywhere. But it was, which is interesting if you start to see the parallels between my first problem I see as my first problem. There was a bunch of wires, there was all these records, but no way for someone to actually hear this music on the airwaves. Right?
Yeah.
I saw this as an opportunity, being from a third world country, having access to a radio station and that type of technology and that type of opportunity was super appealing. So it turns out not a lot of people had that interest, right? So I found my way and started speaking to the right people, the right supervisors, and they're like, "You want to be in charge? Here you go. You're a general manager now." And so I was like, "Great. I think I know what I want to do." So besides, drinking beer and having parties in the radio station and doing all that, I started to realize that the fundamental problem was, for lack of a better word, the interface of the board itself, right? That most folks who are going to sit there and operate this radio station weren't going to be able to solder inputs onto a board, right? That we had to find a way to make it more accessible. We had to find a way for people to plug and play. And so, with that said, I did my research and quite ambitiously thought I could do some of it, which I couldn't. So I went to the local radio shop, started asking around about electrical engineers who might have, some experience around that, around radios and all that. Sure enough, I got handed a card of an Eastern European fellow who was exactly into that and knew exactly what he was doing there. The trouble was he was in the middle of a medical situation where he was passing a stone. And so working with him early on was a terrific challenge because as soon as he showed up, he looked at what we had and he says, I know exactly what to do. I know exactly how much time it will take me. He walked up to our antenna and he said, we can bump up our signal to be a professional level radio station. That's the kind of equipment
Wow.
you have, just so you know. So he left us for several weeks with that,
Yeah.
because he had to naturally, for lack of a better word, work through things. So with that, after several weeks of thinking about this and thinking about, I'm on my side thinking about, okay, what type of inputs would I need? Well, this opens up the possibility of me streaming online. This opens up the possibility of me plugging into our local, computer, blah, blah, blah. Um, this started becoming really, really fun, right? Eventually, when he got back with us, yes, we did just that. We hooked it up so that you could plug in quarter-inch cables. And, quite simply, with my knowledge of limited knowledge with sound equipment, I was able to hook things up and we were on the air. And I don't know how legal it was, how much power we had, but we were on the air. So that was kind of my long story short. That was my first kind of technical problem to solve. And I look back and reflect well on that moment because it really portrays what I like today about APIs and kind of how that brought me here today because it was a mix of problem solving from a user perspective and a business perspective combined with quickly picking up technical acumen and figuring out how quickly can I get rolling without feeling limited by not being an electrical engineer,
Yeah.
for that matter. And so with that, make it quick for the rest of it because I think the rest of it is a little bit boring. The rest of my professional career, I think leading up to this point has been lots of retail management. So lots of user and customer interaction where I've learned on the ground kind of how do you talk to people? How do you respond to yelling customers? That kind of thing.
Yeah.
How do you process refunds without giving those kind of situations really helped me. Retail, restaurant management. Eventually, I landed myself the perfect customer service gig in a startup, which was also a business analyst position and a product position and what have you. So I got my foot in the door by answering phone calls for a SaaS product that offered financing for point of sale financing for things that are like tires and mattresses and things under $5,000 basically.
Yeah.
So I found myself servicing the needs of vendors and customers who were both interacting on a dual face type of platform that was basically uh, better or worse was kind of in a monolith kind of situation where it was two-faced app, and folks were needing problem resolution and the development team needed folks like on the kind of customer service side who could see the problem for what it was as opposed to the reported problem, right?
Yeah.
And that's where I started to shine. And it wasn't quick. I was very naive, and I was texting the CEO and texting the COO and saying, "Hey, I'll do this for free. I know we have all these data analysts and all these business analysts. I'd love to get my foot in the door." This is kind of my third world mentality where I perhaps devalued myself early on, but I look back to that as one of the main experiences that brought me to finally understanding, getting so nerded out about APIs, because over there, I got to do everything from being a scrum master to a product owner to a business analyst to a project manager to everything, right? To a
Yeah.
UX designer, and also looking at API documents like XML API documents, JSON documents, working with actual integrators that are tied in deeply with the customer base and figuring out why certain API requests aren't working. So it was almost like an API support analyst role, but
Yeah.
it got my hand dirty enough to where I just went off on my own and started studying what does it mean to have RESTful APIs? How do they power microservices? What are the benefits, business benefits of all of that? That's where I started to learn that people were still not kind of connecting the dots between the thing and why now? You know what I
Yeah.
mean? And so that brought me to an organization that deals with organ transplantation, doing helping them design and
So,
deploy some of their
or
API products. Yeah.
what
Oh,
one, yeah, one
stopped
other,
it.
yeah, one other, yeah, one other question there. Like,
Yeah.
so it sounds to me like, you know, it through a lot of your experience that, kind of what you just said of people not really, understanding the value of kind of good API strategy and like why you should care. And like those were a
Yeah.
couple of really great examples. And like
Yeah.
just to state it, like teenage me sounds super jealous, is
Yeah.
super jealous of you like getting to go play with a radio station. Like
Oh
that
yeah.
is freaking amazing.
Yeah.
And I might be forever jealous that that's the case. Cause even when I was a kid, the only thing when I was a kid, if you asked me what I wanted to be when I grew up, it was to be on the radio. That's the only
Yeah.
thing I wanted to be. And
Yeah.
anything to like, hey, this is like my radio station. You want to fix it? Go fix it. Awesome.
It
Love it.
was dream come true. I might not have seen it then that way, but
Yeah, yeah. That's isn't that funny how that works?
yeah.
But like, thinking about back to like, kind of API strategy is one of those interesting things of like a lot of people don't think that it's a big thing, but it kind of is. And
Mhm.
looking back across all of your experience in those things, like what would you like, how would you kind of convince somebody that API strategy really is a thing that you should think about?
Okay. That's a great question. And I think there's a couple layered answer here. I think first of all, it's helping people understand that things like APIs and other technical assets are no different than any other product. It has its consumers and its producers. And if we start to, and I think maybe I'll just say in general, if we start to think about them from the perspective of how these folks are interacting, then we are less concerned with, do I have X number of technical assets? I'm more concerned with how these technical assets, each one, are enabling some type of interaction, right? And so why would a business care? It's up to us, and I take that fully as as my role in the technical product management world. It's up to us to be able to identify and connect the dots between business value and things such as APIs, right? So how would I explain to a business executive that there's importance in delivering a good API strategy? Well, it's often a good way to illustrate the importance of something by indicating what's missed if something isn't in place. So if a good API strategy isn't in place, the effects are, in my eyes, apparent, right? They're downstream and they're indirect, but they are apparent.
Yeah.
And so it's being able to articulate those indirect kind of, why did it take your UI team 3 months to be able to give you an app? Because, they were relying on an underlying app team that needed to build an API strategy, needed to build an API product, uh, and didn't have a proper strategy in place and did kind of things willy-nilly and didn't even think about how it's going to be consumed or whether that should have any impact on the design. So that's those are the kind of conversations that we need to be able to have with business leaders to start to get to think about APIs and other technical product things like products, right? They're no different. They're just a different context and different, personas involved.
Yeah, yeah, that's really great. I mean, it, one of the things, and this is not totally true, but it is a little bit. One of the funny things that I see in a lot of organizations is that they almost don't even know how their business runs. Like they know how it runs from an operational perspective or from a
Excellent point.
technology perspective. Like I don't really exactly know how this works. We have all of these pieces, we have hundreds of services, we have all of these things, but no one really quite knows. And
Yeah,
I kind of look at API strategy as, we're going to be deliberate on why and how we're doing this and having a clear path towards, say I'm an e-commerce company. I actually know how an order is processed and I
100%.
can try to optimize that process through kind of product thinking and other things. But if you don't have a good kind of solid API strategy underneath, you're going to be flailing in the wind in a
Yeah,
lot of ways
yeah.
because it's like, well, I don't know, so I can't optimize something that I don't know about.
Yeah, and I can't justify, to your point, I can't justify that optimization even. You know what I mean? So, for a really good example here of not even knowing what I have in my hands, right? Imagine a banking solutions organization that is building, payments related solutions for these top level banks, right?
Yeah,
And these banks are using this data that they're being given for free through API interface, through these interfaces that are not just user interfaces, and those those banks are selling this data to their customer based on how fresh that data is. Meanwhile, on our side, that's just kind of free. We don't even know it's being sold. So it's to your point, not understanding like part of not having a good API strategy in place, in this case, a monetization, indirect monetization strategy in place, then we're missing the point and starting to leave money on the table on this case. You know what I mean?
yeah. I think a really good real life example of that in the public space has been the Reddit APIs, where they were giving out access to the Reddit APIs for free forever, and there were whole
Yeah.
businesses built on top of this free API. And then Reddit says, "Hey, we're actually going to start monetizing our API." Which, if you look at what are the best kind of search engines in the world? You have kind of Google, you have YouTube, and then Reddit's going to be in the top 5 probably of actual good answers for a given problem. And to not have a monetization strategy on that API is almost criminal in some ways if you're the CEO. I
Yeah.
honestly think they went a bit too far,
Yeah.
possibly, but that's a little bit up for debate. But it's kind of crazy that a company like that didn't really understand what they were doing.
Yeah, I think you're hitting the nail on the head here, Chris, because it's the have not having the strategy in place, and I'll throw a little tidbit about API monetization, right? Would you sell a brand new product on the market without understanding how you're going to price it, how specifically you're going to price your product, how you're going to build your margins, any of that? Would you do that with any product?
No, absolutely not.
Then why would we do that with our APIs? So that's where we sum up some of I've seen another example of that Reddit API consumption thing. We've given something away for free all this time. People are depending on it. People are consuming it. Now we're going to say you're getting no more than that. You're getting the same thing. However, you'll have to pay. What does that do to your product? Does
Yeah.
that kill it? Does your product survive because it was so valuable? You know what I mean? So
Mhm.
it's that same thing. Yeah.
Well, I also, um, yeah, I agree. It is a very interesting problem of it's almost a product problem in some ways where people have looked at their product as being their UI or their app or their whatever for a long time. And the idea of having data as a product or a part of the product is something that is still kind of relatively new.
Yeah.
And
Mhm.
that I think is where the gaps are. There's a handful of kind of partnerships and tools that are out there that I work with on a day-to-day basis that I've actually gone to them and said, "Hey, could you provide the stuff just via API. Your UI is great, but I don't necessarily need that. I just
Yeah,
want the API and I'll pay for it.
yeah,
But, you know, I want to take, you know, your kind of data and your thinking and kind of plus that into something else. And, you know, there, if you're not thinking about monetizing your data, you're doing it wrong.
yeah. And more organizations need that type of interface, need that type of scalability, composability. You know what I mean? Not organizations don't want to rely on three different user interfaces their users have to log into. You know what I mean? So
Yeah.
it's super crucial to have that in place because you'll see other problems emerge. You know, you'll start to see, in my example, in the transplant business, you start to see all these integration businesses that build these small little apps that help solve the problem of a poor integration experience. And that's all they're doing. But they
Yeah.
charge a lot. You know what I mean? So,
So who do you who do you see as kind of responsible for kind of API strategy? In a lot of ways, it seems like it can almost be not anyone in particular, but I'll keep mine. How do you see that when, you know, from a
yeah.
like a successful business perspective? How do you see API strategy being set and kind of driven forward?
Yeah. Great question here. I think for me, API strategy is it's not, you know, we have to treat this strategy similar to perhaps other types of strategies that we see in our world that work, right? So for me, there's some key patterns to establish here in API strategy as well. Do we have a grassroots kind of a communication line, right? So what I mean by that is, are we finding are we finding that when we're developing an API strategy, that it's just a few leaders that are saying, hey, do A, B, or C? Or are we taking into account the perspective and opinions of people that are on the ground, people that are leaders, people that are architects, people that are QA professionals, you know, people that are front-end web developers? Are we taking all that into account? And I think that's ultimately what it comes down to, API strategy. I'm going to pause here for a second because lost my train of thought there. What
No,
was
no
there?
problem. So like so I'll just a I guess a secondary kind of question. So
Yep.
I would say a lot of architects would
Mhm.
throw their hat in and say, I own this. Do you see
Right,
that
right.
as do you see that as being successful or
I think that
is that a pattern that you kind of want to stay away from?
I think it's definitely an anti-pattern, right? That being said, there are phases to this. You can't say all of a sudden I have a community of practice that's talking about APIs that spans the whole organization, spans job personas and their roles and everything. You have to start somewhere. It may start with a group of architects that are building this team together. Eventually, the output of this team shouldn't just be people, should be some sort of automated guidance, some sort of automated solution that's easy enough for developers and producers of APIs and consumers of APIs to use, right? So it's a grassroots thing. It's a it's a developing kind of a team structure that takes into account the big picture as opposed to just, hey, what's the right way to do this, right?
Yeah.
There's REST guidelines, and then there are organizational level style guides that inform the developers, hey, everything else into account, this is how you overlay our direction. You know, that should come from a mixed group of people. So that's I think, and maybe one more anti-pattern I've seen is, and it's kind of going back to the same thing, is we don't need more hall monitors, and we don't need a strictly top-down directive. That doesn't work from a long-term change perspective. It has to be both-ended, right? It has to be something that the leadership is bought in and is really encouraging and enabling their staff to do, but it has to be also bought in on the grassroots level. Like people in the development teams and the consumption teams should feel empowered that they have a voice in this strategy. You know what I mean? Because you'll
Yeah.
be surprised how much they know, to be quite honest. And so I think that's helping us one lay out the strategy, right? So anti-pattern, maybe one thing I'll add more here is it's important to go, you can't boil the ocean. right? So when it comes to strategy, API strategy, it's important to think about your producers and your consumers and your current use cases and your current pain points. It'll establish you to lay some baseline somewhere and start somewhere and build on that and see where the gaps are.
Yeah.
So the temptation to have a full style guide or a full whatever, resist that, because again, you're applying product thinking to everything. You know what I mean? And I think that's what we mean by data as a product, API as a product. We're not saying yes, we're saying they're product, but we're saying apply product thinking to these assets.
Yeah. So, so what, so you kind of brought up a couple of them there, but what do you think what are the attributes of like a good API strategy? Like, you mentioned style guides and a couple other things, but like, what do there's kind of what you said of like, I'm going to like nail down every single possible thing and you're going to have no leeway to do anything. And then there's having nothing. And then there's everything in between. But what do you see as kind of the sweet spot of a good API strategy?
Yeah, I think sweet spot is kind of a well, it depends kind of situation. Like, where is the team at? What are their
Spoken
consumption
like a
needs?
true
Right?
consultant.
I had to use it somewhere. But I have to say that, the sweet spot, I think there is really, it really does depend, It's like
Yeah.
you really need to think about what interaction are you trying to enable. So if you think about, you know, simply, I hear a lot, right? I need a developer portal.
Yeah.
For me, the question that just opens up a flood of questions. I know it does for you too, Chris. But I would,
I have opinions for sure.
yeah, yeah, exactly. So it's like, hey, now that you've triggered me, what is it about the developer portal that you need? Well, we got to have our APIs somewhere. Okay. Well, who needs to find your APIs? Oh, well, we have partner developers. We're thinking we might go develop a public API, blah, blah, blah. And so all of those interactions, how do we build a strategy around that? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
I think that would be a better served conversation than saying, hey, what type of developer portal we need? Instead, we should be talking about, hey, we have partner front end developers that need to consume our APIs, specifically this API or this endpoint or this type of data. And we need to expose that so that they can scale So we're talking specifically about the interaction. And it just so happens the best way to do it maybe is a developer portal. Maybe it's just a Confluence page. Maybe it's a GraphQL schema, interpolation schema. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So yeah, I'll
It,
stop there.
it, it also, there's probably more than one strategy or more than one leg to that given strategy, because
Yeah.
if you think about the internal APIs, okay, great. I have a strategy for that.
Yep.
I have a strategy for developing them. I have a strategy for discoverability and everything else through things like a developer portal. But your strategy is going to be very different for an external API, because you need to think about better security. You need to think about rate limiting. You need to think about monetization and all of the things that don't necessarily apply to internal APIs, at least the same way.
Yeah, so to me, that's where the opinionatedness comes in, right? I believe, and I know a lot of the community is of the same belief as well. Um, I believe that you do treat your internal APIs as products, that we have to find a way to understand the context better. So we still implement authorization, we still implement authentication. It's just a matter of scoping and, how it applies to that specific principle. For example, I need an internal developer portal. That's the output or the thing that people are asking for.
Yeah.
The question to be asked is, what reusable assets do you have? For example, APIs. How are you designing those APIs? Is there some guidance around those designs? How are you publishing those APIs? Maybe it's just simply, a flat document. Maybe it's a way for you to try it in the developer portal itself. Maybe it comes with auth tokens or access tokens that you can hit the API yourself. So it's very important to even your internal products treat them, even your internal APIs treat them as products and be able to understand the difference in context. Yes, but quite often what ends up happening is internal functionality that's been built into an API. People, product owners and product managers and business professionals will go to teams and say, hey, I want APIs. What do you got? You must have some
Yeah.
internal APIs. What do you got? And it turns out that you start digging and you realize nothing is where it needs to be. Nothing works the way it's supposed to. And perhaps that was part of the problem all along. You know what I mean? And
Yeah.
it sure is. So yeah,
Well,
that's just my opinion there, where it's internal products, internal APIs should definitely still be API products and treated as such.
I totally agree. And there's, in everything, there's like people problems, process problems, and technology problems. And this is another great example of, you know, a lot of people when talking about, you know, APIs and dev portals and those types of things, it's, well, what is the technical contract for the API?
Right.
But there's also like kind of an operational contract, for lack of a better words, of, well,
Yep.
here's how you actually use this thing. It's
Yep.
building that trustworthiness and discoverability of, here's exactly what I'm doing with this API. Here's what you can expect. All of these given things that have really nothing to do with it technologically, but everything to do with building out that API strategy for the organization. That this is what if you're going to do an API, this is what
Mhm.
I would expect. And these are the standards that I would hold you by. And if you don't have them, you're going to slow everyone else down. And that's not acceptable.
Yeah. Yeah. Then it's a matter of, why would you just put something out there to put it out there, right? It's supposed to serve an outcome, just
Yeah.
like products.
Or you put it out there half ass. And that goes to the product thinking
Yep.
you're thinking of. It's like,
Yeah.
okay, well, would you ever put out an app on the app store
Yeah.
that doesn't have a login?
Yeah.
It doesn't have documentation of how to use it. It doesn't have any of those things. Like, no, you would never do that.
Yeah.
Why would you do that for something internally when you're just shooting yourself in the foot by
100%.
doing all of that? And it can have really severe impacts to an organization overall. And go to the thing that I was talking about earlier of
Mhm.
people not knowing how their business actually operates. This is the root of the
Yep.
problem that
Yep.
leads you to that particular space of not knowing.
Yeah. Yeah. Unintended silos. Yeah. You can't help it. Exactly right.
Yeah. So, I think I think that's some super interesting stuff. But you've also done some really interesting stuff around like API design. You've been helping out a company and you've been kind of helping them on this journey, which I think is really interesting. You want to kind of tell me a little bit about that?
Yeah, yeah, I'm really excited to talk about this. So, there's an organization called Alliance of Native Seed Keepers, and it was formed by, I'm trying to get these names right, make sure, Victoria Ferguson, Dwayne Painter, Beth Roach, and Fix. They are folks that well, Beth at least, I got involved with her, uh, working on the water keepers. So I'm involved in a lot of kind of civil things and civic things, and try to help out where I can. And I'm pretty active. And so with that, they have formed an organization called Alliance of Native Seed Keepers, and I got in touch with them simply based off of a response on a Facebook post around, hey, we need an API developer. Can somebody help? And I started getting real curious. And so it's heartwarming work for me, because the more I got involved, the more I got hooked, the more I learned about them, the more I was like, this is something I need to be a part of. And Beth and Fix have basically become brothers and sisters to me at this point, and they've really open armed taken me into the community. So it means a lot. So without too much more on the emotional part, they're basically call themselves, they're funding all a seed house, which they have a storefront where they're selling seeds that are helping fund their cultural efforts. What does that mean? tying their roots back to their native people, bringing them back and doing some land reclamation and funding societies. And how do you help build a society, right? It's not just giving people a job, it's giving them a grocery store, it's giving them
Yeah.
ways to live, so there's all these humongous efforts, and the seed house is exactly that, a seed to all those efforts for their efforts, right? So with that, they uh they not only are trying to use those profits to help share cultural of or raise cultural awareness, but they're also trying to basically get to a point where they can losing my train of thought here. So they're also they're there it is. So they're part of their mission is also to preserve the identity that's tied to the seed itself
Yeah.
and to their tribes and how what it's meant to them, right? Their whole life, how, some of that has, as we all know, been stripped away from them, right? So they're in the process of healing. And in many ways, this little seed store represents a lot of that. So where I came into
What's
play
their
is,
what's the URL for the seed store?
oh, good. Yeah, good call. So they're
Yeah.
called, it's Alliance of Native Seedkeepers.com. And if you go to their Birth of the Alliance page, then you'll get to read up a little bit about their mission and
Yeah.
stuff like that too.
And we'll put the link for that in the description of the
Sweet.
of everything too. So but I just want to get it out there and give them a little bit of a
Yeah.
shout out as well.
And I was gonna say, if anyone's interested, feel free to order some seeds. If you're a full on farmer, you full on are into it, do your thing. If you're not and trying to get into it, start here. You'll be funding a great cause. So yeah, feel free to hit them up and learn as much as you can about
Yeah. So what kind of what kind of they said that you said they wanted an API
it.
developer, like what was really the problem they were having, and how did you kind of go about figuring out what to do for them?
It's interesting. A great question. It's interesting what their problem really was and is, and where I found myself with these folks and why I was so excited to join in. First, when someone, first just I got triggered with the, hey, I need an API developer. Well, do you really need a developer? What do you need the API for? You're asking again for a developer portal, right? So that sort of thinking happened, but this was on a friend basis and someone that I'd worked with and looked up to and I know is involved with the Sierra Club and all kinds of stuff, right? So I wanted to be as helpful as possible, and I saw this as an opportunity for me to kind of materialize some of the things that are in my head. And so, yeah, I responded to, hey, API developer, what are you looking for? Then I started learning, hey, we actually have this shop. This is how we're selling things. It's a Wix. Uh, I don't know if we need to cut that out, but it's a
Yeah,
Wix
you're good.
store. It's a Wix store where we do all these manual things. We have some automations we built into Wix, and I basically fix, I with some help maybe have designed this whole web experience to help people purchase seeds. And guess what? It's selling, and people are buying month over month. There's growth on sales. So it's perfect. Right now, the huge problem is they have done a bunch of assessment on their sides and looked at what could work for a warehouse management system for them, right? By the way, the thing that's really cool about this and was weird and interesting is you might think that they didn't come from a tech savvy background, that people like Fix, they have an interesting affinity to technology,
Yeah.
understanding that technology is their way out of some of their problems, right? So that was interesting for me because a lot of times you find an enterprise having to convince leadership of that. Here
Yeah.
I found the opposite, where the leadership was like, hey, it's like, it's interesting you're talking about APIs, first of all, right? So, but I found the more I dug, the more I realized they're actually doing assessment. They have really good SEO talents, which is why this thing is blowing up. Like
Yeah.
they're doing a lot of the things right. The web design was good, even though it was probably low code, you know what I mean? Which is great. So I started to see the opportunity of, okay, well, what they meant was we need an API developer to help us stitch this warehouse management system, which is SKU Savvy, another up and coming, highly recommend for folks to check out SKU Savvy. But it's one of those things where they're like, we've picked out this warehouse management system. We've realized our bottleneck is on there are these three main workflows, right? The pick flow, the packaging flow, and the shipment flow, which basically all, other than inventory management itself, the whole warehouse management solution presents a unified experience for them to pull in their Wix data or whatever shopfront data,
Yeah.
and there's webhooks available, there's GraphQL endpoint available. So all sorts of things that were like, okay, we know this is an API first product. We need an API developer because we need to hook this up to Wix. Well, it turns out it took me 6 weeks to prove that it was the poorest integration possible. And it was like call after call, setting things up, figuring out, testing, creating different objects in SKU Savvy, pulling data from Wix. Turns out they had a built-in like integration with Shopify, and they've made a lot of accommodations of course, for
Yeah.
Shopify.
Yeah.
And to them, then the conversation became, I realized this at this point, I'm already engaged. I'm assessing it to them. I'll tell them what it'll cost. Maybe things can just get plugged in. Maybe we'll need to hire some development help, blah, blah, blah. And all this is happening. And we get to a point where I'm starting to now have the conversation with them. You might need to think about moving off this platform onto Shopify. What's keeping
Yeah.
you on Wix? You know what I mean? And it turns out not much. It turns out that actually the Shopify experience was better for them to begin with, and it opened up a whole new slew of integration opportunities, and out of the box integration with their chosen warehouse management system. Which, keep in mind, they had less options with the warehouse management system than they had with the Shopfront, right?
Of course. Yeah.
So and Shopify is no joke, right? I took some long, deep looks at it before I made the recommendation. And I also looked at what it might mean to migrate. Fairly simple. So it's been a matter of working with them to onboard this new software, understand everything, from an integration perspective. I've also gotten them to get a Zapier account. Now we have our own sorts of automations that are taking place.
Yeah.
I've also set them up with a kind of a database now, a PostgreSQL database where we're starting to build our own artifacts around what data objects look like and what they mean to us. All in the idea of, taking all these domain-driven design principles into account, all with the idea of, hey, I can help this organization take low-code principles such as APIs and move forward in their journey until they're ready for building custom solutions, which we're already starting to explore those options, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, that's kind of where I came in, and shortly after have taken on a leadership role there, and very excited about it for sure.
Well, that's a really interesting kind of growth story to me where, there's, we, and a lot of the stuff that we deal with on a day-to-day basis, it's, multinational organizations, thousands
Yeah.
of people.
Yeah.
But a lot of those same technology problems exist for a mom and pop shop that has two employees.
Exactly.
And, I mean, there's kind of the adage of every business is a software development business now, which is not untrue in a lot of ways where,
Yeah.
you have to manage your website. If you're going to sell stuff, you've got everything that you're just talking about is inventory management and sales and taxes and shipping and logistics and all kinds of things that have nothing to do with baking cookies or whatever it is that you're actually doing.
Exactly. Yeah.
So so thinking about that kind of, shift of like, you were on Wix and then you like, if you were to kind of redo it all again, like, would you do it would you learn from it? Would you kind of do things different? Do you feel like you ended up in the right place? And,
good question. I think we made the right move. I think we had to do what we had to do. If I could do it all over again, I'd have someone else do all the API testing. which was fun at first, but then it got painful, and it
So
would have been nice to
what
just
kind of
kind of
testing are you? So when you talk about just API testing, like what were you actually like? What were you doing, and what was the problem that you were actually trying to solve?
man, if this was like, I mean, I'll throw another name out there. If this was like Chat GPT APIs, then I would have had less problem testing. If they were documented and explained like Chat GPT APIs, it would be different. But in this case, all I had was you know, a source of what the objects look like. I wasn't able to, I was able to interpolate the schema for a GraphQL endpoint. What I had to figure out was, how do I take orders, the object that's represented as orders um Wix, and how do I create a new order in SKU Savvy without there being any like plug and play integrations available, right?
Yeah,
So I had to think about, okay, as soon as an order is created, are there any mechanisms for me to get some event-driven communication from Wix? Turns out there is. Could I plug it into something like Zapier and have it do some kind of action to call an API from SKU Savvy and create an order there so that the workflow can take on from there? Turns out, yes, I can. So doing all that, but even within the time that I figured it out, Zapier even has escalated. It wasn't able to do then what it can now. You know what I mean?
yeah,
But it took a lot to do of that to be able to say, this is still a weak integration and this is stitched together. And that, yes, there are webhooks and yes, there are events communicating, but there's too much of a burden in the middle. You know what I mean? Like
yeah.
where you're better off building a custom solution to make that integration happen, or you're better off moving your storefront. And what makes sense for you? Well, it'll take you 2 days to, 2 days to a week to move your storefront, and you have a working integration, which we have tested, by the way. I've
Yeah.
tested it with a fake Shopify store and see that it's reading stuff. It actually um, maintains like a live connection where data points are transferring. So yeah, that's what it came down to. I wouldn't change much about the decision. I would, if this had been better documented, like some of the same things we're talking about, if my interaction with what was available to me, as far as functionality was better, then I would have been able to solve the same thing that took me several weeks, probably in a day. You know what
And
I mean?
so, I mean, that really kind of ties it back to like general API strategy. If the
Yeah,
people you were integrating with had a
yeah,
better API strategy, that, here's how people are using it. Here's the objects that you can use. Here's all of these things that
yeah,
if it was relatively straightforward, then
yeah,
you
yeah.
could have
Because
spent a lot more time or could have saved a lot of time.
yeah, and I mean, maybe we got lucky here, but we could have gone with the other decision and say, you know what? We're just going to have to figure out another warehouse management system and stick with Wix because it's too much of an effort. And
Yeah.
that would have been a bad decision, I think,
Well, and think of
from a
the
composability and extensibility perspective. You know what I mean?
yeah, and think of the business impact that that could have to what would you say, SKU savvy. So, if their APIs aren't good enough to be able to integrate with, you're going to lose a lot of customers.
Yeah,
And one of the one of the challenges that I have with a lot of vendor tools, along with some like low code, no code platforms, is they'll work until they don't.
yeah,
And
yeah,
once you hit that wall and you never know where that wall is going to be, you have almost no
exactly.
remediation after that. Like
Yeah,
you're just no, it just can't do it. You're out of
yeah,
luck.
yeah,
You can go beg to them to try to get them to build something, but good luck.
yeah,
And that's when you know, I've seen people have to scramble to try to build some other
yeah.
mechanism, and it can be a mess.
And it's really a tense situation, like for example, like with SKU Now, one thing I want to say, the SKU Savvy, the fact that they have a GraphQL endpoint and I'm able to interpolate data and I can read it and use it and was able to test and call endpoints without a whole lot of documentation goes to show you they were designed pretty well. You know what I
Yeah.
mean?
Yeah.
And they're good. They're good. They're not well documented like GraphQL APIs. I want to throw that out there. I don't want to throw them under the bus on this because In fact, if I wasn't able to test, which would very likely, right? If I wasn't even able to hit the endpoint, then I'd be in trouble, right?
Yeah.
And 10 years ago, I might not have had the capability to do this with Zapier, right? Like I might have said, "Oh no, there's no integration between SKU Savvy and no integration between Wix. I need to build a custom solution."
Yeah.
And it may still be in a silo. That solution may still have to exist in a silo. Like users might still have to log into three things because there's no integration available. And
That's right.
that's what poor API strategy and poor not thinking about APIs as products, that's where it lands us.
So if like thinking about kind of that last statement, where if I'm somebody listening to this and like, oh yeah, I don't want to be that, like, how do I where do you even kind of begin, like how would you kind of think about the journey of improving my overall API strategy? I
Mm.
know that's a super broad question, but
That's a definitely super broad, but
yeah.
I knew you weren't gonna take it easy on me. So but I think it goes back to like focusing on your business need and use case. In this case, like let me just take the Alliance of Native Seed Keepers as an example. I could have right now I'm thinking about automation on the customer support side, right? Do we actually need a CRM? Can it be, something makeshift and there's ticket management somewhere? There are all these tools out there, right? But it's kind of like really go back to your interactions that are problems for you in your business and opportunities, right? And sometimes it means looking into an opportunity before realizing it's a problem or an opportunity.
Yeah.
But a lot of times these things are glaring things, glaring problems. We hear from clients all the time, I need a developer portal, or I need an API gateway, or I need to I need an IAM kind of product. And you're like, wait, let's talk about what you really need. Like, you know what I mean? So
Yeah.
I think it's going back to like asking yourself enough, yes, I want to think API first. I want to think about how do I build my APIs, even internal ones as API as products, but I really want to prioritize based on where my business opportunities are. The only way to do that is to think about the consumers and the producers and the type of interactions they need to engage in.
Yeah. And I totally agree. And I would layer on top of that, like, yes, you want to listen to them, but you know, building those feedback loops
Yeah,
to both of them is just incredibly critical. How well did this actually work for you? What could we do to improve it? You
yeah,
just used this kind of obscure feature. Did it, help you, whatever?
yeah,
And, you need to do that on both sides of the equation too, of, you can't just focus on the producer or the consumer. A lot of people want to focus on the consumer because they're the end user.
yeah,
And well, that's not necessarily the only person that you should be thinking about as well. I mean, the developers
right.
and everybody else that are building the APIs have a lot of problems too, probably.
Yeah,
And like that to me is in a lot of these different cases of how do you really understand the problem, like getting a look across there, where are the problems actually, and then you can figure out how to narrow it in. So instead of
yeah,
that super super broad question, you can now say, well, hey, I have this, no one can find my APIs. No one knows how to interoperate with them. Okay, great. Maybe a dev portal is the right thing to do. But starting with, I want a dev portal is rarely ever a good idea.
yeah. It's good for us, for us consultants to hear things like that because we easily hear them as red flags, right? We've been trained. But I think one thing I haven't mentioned, and you really helped me get to that here, and I want to make sure I mention, like some of the best practices I've seen in organizations around good API strategy and having a good API ecosystem goes to the design process. And are you thinking about APIs from a design first perspective or from a code first perspective? None of those worlds are perfectly executable, in isolation, right? Because there's always green field work, there's brown field work, and somewhere along the middle, you can't just have non-technical people design the whole thing, right? but there is a middle ground there. If your strategy can find that sweet spot of middle ground of how do I think from an API design perspective, but still, get some of the infrastructure work automated to where it's not completely dependent on the design, but it's the design is the source of truth where the business rules, all of that kind of gets fleshed out to the point where now the developer can spin this up based off of API contracts or what have you, right?
Yeah.
So there is a sweet spot there. um, I'm not gonna lie, it's never very clean, but it's important to think about what aspects of that in your organization you can automate and what aspects of the design first process you can start to apply. Like, hey, can I coach my product management and my architects enough to have those high level conversations around, hey, is this going to be a REST API? Is this going to be an event driven API? What does that look like? What are objects associated with that?
Yeah.
So enabling folks to have that conversation early on. And to your point, the feedback loops in that design process, you think about design thinking, it's really all ideas until people can touch it and play it, right? The prototyping and all of that. So early on in that design process, how can you enable folks to test those endpoints? Can you mock endpoints? Can you mock responses for people to get started, right? A lot
Yeah.
of the problem is around the bottleneck of people depending on APIs to be ready before they can build anything. So you're kind of tackling two birds with one stone here. Not only are you getting feedback for your API development process through your design process by letting people touch it and feel it, but you're also giving them an opportunity to start to build what they can based on off of current alignment, right? So
Yeah. Yeah, that kind of, when the concept of contracts is something that I think is just incredibly valuable. And, they now have like contract testing through things like Pact.io and there's other kind of tools out there, but excuse me, the, being able to design, come up with that contract and enforce that contract and also understand what are the implications when that contract changes
right.
is, there's like the concept of day one. And then what about day 20 or day 200? Like,
Yeah.
how do you get away from those initial kind of designs and things start to change? But if you're not keeping a good handle on that, you
Yeah.
can end up in kind of chaos.
Yeah, good. That's a great point you brought up. So we've mentioned a little bit about monetization strategy, right? We haven't really gotten into versioning and versioning strategy. These are the kind of things you talk about during design. You don't want to paint yourself in a corner. We know some famous organizations that have said in the past, we'll never, we'll never not support an API. You know what I mean? It'll always be in existence. Is that right for your organization? Is that right to paint yourself in a corner like that? Or is it better for you to identify, hey, we know what best practices look like from a versioning perspective. We know how to mitigate, the breaking changes for our consumers. Let's lay out a path for that so that we're all set up for success instead of saying we'll never update an API. Because that either you actually never do it and ends up costing you too much, or you break your promise. You know what I mean? So
Or you grind your business to an absolute halt because you
yeah,
can't actually get
yeah,
anything done.
yeah, 100%.
Yeah. Any other kind of tools or techniques that you think of when it comes to kind of just crafting a good strategy? Or things like people to look out for, like through the design session, like um, be wary of these things or something of that nature.
Yeah, I think mainly be wary of being too dogmatic. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
I'm the first proponent of design first. I'm the first proponent of APIs as a product. You have to uh, you have to be kind of flexible with your decisioning here, and keep in mind, like things you will feel differently, and different decisions will make sense later on, right? So with some grace, be flexible, do your best to implement the best practices, but at the end, realize that you'll have to make compromises and you'll have to find what works now and perhaps in a way that doesn't block you in from what you want to do in the future.
Yeah. Well, this was a really really fun conversation. I feel like I learned a lot, and I always really enjoy talking to you.
Same here, Chris. Always a pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, man. Pleasure.